just staring at me. I'm trying so hard to make sense of this. Tidal waves, all of my thoughts are washed away again.
Let's have a look at the drums. I'll walk you through all the individual tracks and the drum bus, and let's see what we have here. Okay, these are all the individual tracks, and all those tracks are going to one pair of effect returns. I know many engineers like to use buses or subgroups for each instrument group, like a drum bus, a guitar bus, a vocal bus, a blah 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 bus. I send everything straight to the mix bus. I have no need for too many subgroups except for the drums. And I do this because I love to use parallel compression on the drums. So the best way for me is I have like one, let's call it a dry drum bus, where all the individual drum elements are sent to. And then I duplicate this and put heavy compression on it and use this in parallel to the dry and uncompressed drum bus, just to add this parallel compression flavor. Let me solo this complete drum section, and I show you what it sounds like with the parallel compression and what it sounds like without, and then I'll show you what the drum compression sounds on its own. So when you're using parallel compression, you can keep the original transients the way they are, but you can also use the sound of compression and this more power ball feeling of compressed drums and add this in parallel to the original signal. So you have best of both worlds. Good transients and nice compression sound. Let's see how I treated this compression bus. The first that I put on is a clipper, and this usually just serves to catch snare hits. Let's see what it does. As you can see, it really catches the snare only, and this is on purpose because the snare tends to have a lot of snap and a lot of energy, and if you don't control this a little bit in, let's say, this kind of heavy hitting genre, you risk of getting a lot of pump in either the drum compression or in the master compression, and the whole mix will bounce with every snare hit, and it will probably lose some attack. This clipping, although it's really shaving off quite a bit of the snare, it still lets it sound pretty snappy. It's not the same as if you would compress or limit it away. If you compress or limit it, it just loses some attack, but by using clipping, it somehow keeps more punch to itself. So before hitting any limiter or compression, I just shave off whatever excess of snare I get into this compression drum bus. Second is a limiter. As very often I use this L2 limiter just to level. Most of the time it's not actually limiting anything. I just use it as basically gain staging element. In this case, I'm pulling down like 1 dB before hitting the actual compressor. Next up, we have my favorite parallel compression compressor. It's an API 2500. I also have it sitting on the mix bus all the time. If it was not sitting on the mix bus, I would use it on the drum bus. But since I only have one, we are using a plugin right now. Let's see how much gain reduction this actually does. There are several ways you can use parallel compression on drums. Let's have a look at the two main ways to use them. Either you want to enhance punch, then you would set the attack in a way that you let pass the first initial transient, so a slower attack, and then pull down the sustain or the body of the drum. So this way, if you add this, you basically add more snap and more transient than anything else. The way I have set it up now is the exact opposite. I have enough snap and enough punch from the uncompressed signal. What I want is more sustain and more body and more like weight to the drums. So I shave off the initial transient, so very quick attack time, and just add some of this pumping, moving body of the drum. Let's listen to this compression drum bass alone one more time. So this appears to be pretty distant. It's not in your face, but it's more like a roomy, more thick drum sound. Let me play it one more time, and then I will put the attack knob to a slower setting, and you will hear that the transients will pop out more, and you will get more of this snappy parallel compression bass if that's what you're after. Listen to this. Can you hear this difference? It's from roomy and more a ball of sound to bam bam, really in your face drum sound. Now let's go through the individual elements of the kit. I would start with the bass drum. The bass drum was captured with two microphones, one dynamic microphone inside and one kind of subkick on the outside. The subkick is basically a speaker that is wired in a way that it's working like a dynamic microphone and catches more of the low end because of just the sheer size of this big microphone. Let's listen to those two signals soloed for a second. This sounds gated, right? But I didn't use an actual gate. I don't like gates because most of the time they somehow still change the attack of the instrument, and sometimes they catch a hit and sometimes they miss some, and I personally find gates pretty annoying, so I go in and do all this stuff manually. Here I just edited all the snare hits out of the bass drum track to get it clean and don't have like a lot of snare and other stuff on my bass drum track. Let's listen to the inside microphone alone and see what we did to it. I disengage all the processing and then we see what we ended up putting on to make it sound the way it does. First is an EQ. Since I have the subkick to add the low end, I only wanted mid-range and high-end punch from this inside mic. So first thing is removed some low end that I didn't want. Next is a really nice piece of equipment. This is a split EQ from Eventide, which lets you EQ transient and sustain individually. I love this plugin because sometimes you need, let's say, the low end to be shorter. You don't want to remove the low end, but you just want the low end to be shorter. And this is exactly what I did here. I didn't want to cut the low end completely, but I didn't want this woo, 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 this long sustain from the low end because I will get this from the subkick. So what I did here is I slightly boosted the low end, but only the transient portion, and I removed massively the sustain part of the low end. Let's see what this does. So as you can hear, it's just shortening the low end of this inside bass drum microphone. Next up is a limiter, and I'm sure it does not do any limiting at all. It's just to increase the gain of that microphone. Yeah, it's not even catching the peaks. Marc played pretty consistently, so there was not a big need for any compression or limiting on the individual tracks. All the parallel compression gives me compression sounds, but no need for any compression or leveling on the actual bass drum. Let's have a look at the sub kick without any processing. Okay, I just wanted low end from this. I didn't want any of the mid-range or the high end. There is not a lot going on anyway, but I just wanted to clean it up. So massive high cut. Let's see what that does. We just use the fundamental, the whoop, whoop, whoop from this microphone. And again, a limiter, I'm pretty sure it's not limiting again at all. Yeah, just adding some gain. Then those two tracks go into the kick folder because I wanted to have maybe some EQ on the sum of these two. I treat these two individual microphones as if they were one. So they are going into this bass drum folder, and here I added some EQ to the sum of these two microphones. Let's see what this does without. Okay, interestingly, I put some automation on the high-end portion of the EQ, as you can see here. Have a look at this. Marc did a great job of playing this part, but I wanted to enhance some of the ones on the first bar. So I wanted more punch on these, and maybe on these double pedal strokes. I wanted the first to be a little bit softer so that the second one would have a little bit more punch, like da-da, not pa-pa, but da-da. And this is exactly what I automated in there to enhance this feeling of the first hit being a little bit softer than the second one. And then I had, like a low mid-range cut just to remove a little bit of boxiness from this EQ. Let's have a look at this again. This gives us a little bit more hi-fi bass drum sound without this whoop, 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 lower mid-range portion. And then there is yet another limiter that certainly also is just there for putting some gain on this bass drum channel. Yeah, no limiting at all. So there is no dynamic work on this track whatsoever. The only thing is this automation on the EQ to, just shape the attack feeling of the bass drum exactly the way I wanted it to be. Okie dokie, let's move on to the snare. Let's have a listen to the snare top microphone without any treatment. I put a note to myself so that I don't forget to mention this right here. I clip gained the hi-hat hits in between out. Let me see, I still have the untreated original. You can hear quite a bit of cymbals and hi-hats. It's not really bad, but I wanted it just a little bit cleaner. We have overheads to get all the brass anyway, so I didn't want it on my individual track, so I just added it out, and I did this by using clip gain. So basically I took a part and just pulled it down in volume. That's it. And in some parts I used spectral editing to just edit out some of the cymbal wash that I didn't want it in there. just to get a little bit cleaner signal without using a gate. Again, I don't like gates because they somehow mess with the attack of the signal, and I just don't like gates at all. They never work 100% the way I want them to, so more manual work. Okay, the first plugin on this snare track is an EQ with a very, very slight boost. It's not even 1 dB, like around 6K. Let's see what that does. A tiny bit of brilliance on the snare. Next one is more interesting. This plugin is called Lo-Fi, and what it's doing, it's adding distortion on the snare. I prefer using a kind of distortion on the snare instead of compression, because you just get a very dense and very sustainy and big snare sound without actually using a compressor. The peaks stay more or less at the same point where they have been before, but you just raise the general perceived volume of the track. Let's have a look what this does. Yeah, it's just adding perceived loudness to this snare, which is really nice. And it somehow also shaves off the initial hard transients of the snare so that they don't hit our compression that is coming a little bit later down the way, and don't let the drums pump on each snare hit. Next up is a split EQ. I wanted to boost the crack of the snare so that the hits sound more crisp, but without risking of pulling up whatever is hi-hat or cymbal bleed into that microphone. So by just boosting the transient part, we get nice crisp attack, but we don't pull up all this sustainy high-end stuff. And I wanted to enhance a little bit the attack of the fundamental of that snare. Let's listen to what this does. So we just get a more snappy sound. Let me solo in on these individual regions that you can hear what part of the sound we are actually treating. This is the fundamental of the snare, so the lowest actual tone that the snare is producing. I just wanted more oomph on that hit. And the high-end part is this. Yeah, it's just the crack of the snare. And next, one more time, I have a clipper that is just controlling the snare. It may seem counterintuitive. Why am I enhancing transient just to shave it off later? It is just that each thing does something very special. The clipper removes the peaks of the snare, but without sacrificing some of the attack. It seems counterintuitive, but it's just what it's doing. I need to control those transient just to avoid that every compression stage or limiting stage that's coming later is going into its knees when the snare is hitting. So just shaving off a little bit of the top of the transient of that snare. Let's see what it does. So as you can see, it's really just taking like 1 dB off just to tame a little bit what is going into the next elements of the chain. Then I see that I duplicated the snare top microphone to add like a snare only parallel compression thing, just to get a little bit more meat out of the snare. So I just duplicated the track and added a compressor and run this in parallel to the uncompressed signal. Let's see what it does. I wanted a little bit more attack, and as I mentioned before on the general drum bus, you can either set a very fast attack and just add body, or you put a slower attack and just add transient. And in this case, I'm going for a somewhat slow attack compared to the attack of a snare drum. So and then it's ducking down the sustain. So we're just adding a little bit of snap. Let's listen to the uncompressed, and then I'm adding in the parallel compressed snare. Just a little bit more punch. And that's almost it for the snare. We have a snare bottom microphone. Let's listen to what this does without any processing. Again, it sounds gated, but it is not gated. I just cut it clean and removed all the bass drum hits that are also on this snare bottom mic. The mic is so close to the bass drum that you eventually get some bass drum hits on there. Let me see, I still have the unedited version. What did it sound like? So the actual hits are exactly the same. I just cut out the bass drums because I wanted to have the bass drum clean and punchy only from the bass drum microphones and the room microphones and nothing else. So what did we do here? First of all, you really have to check for the phase relationship between individual microphones that are capturing the same thing. So snare bottom and snare top microphone, they are recording the same instrument, and since one head is moving in the other direction towards the microphone than the other head, you really need to make sure that both microphones work into the same direction. So if one microphone wants the speaker to move towards you and the other one wants to pull it away from you, you get cancellation. What we did here EQ-wise is just adding a little low cut just to clean up the low end, whatever is left of the bass drum, we just clean it up a tiny bit. And again, we have split EQ doing the same thing as on the snare top, adding a little bit of crack of the snare wires only on the attack and removing the sustainy part of it. Let's see what that does. It's just shortening this snare wire. I think it's more ksh instead of ksh. That's all it does. Then we added one sample to the snare. It is not really essential, and I wanted to go without any added samples for this song just to show what you can do without using something out of a box. Let me show you what the drums sound like soloed without this snare sample, and then I add in the snare sample. I just wanted to give it a little bit more size than I was able to get out of the rooms that I have. I don't have a huge drum room. I will show you a trick that I used on the room microphones to enlarge the drum room, but there are limits to this, and I wanted just a little bit bigger sound. That's why I added this one sample. It could be perfectly fine without it, but I show you what it sounds like with and without. So as you can hear, it's not a huge difference. It's just that the snare is a little bit bigger. Let me solo this added snare sample for you to hear what it sounds like. As you can hear, it's been recorded in a bigger room. It has a nice snap to it. What I did is I made sure that, first of all, the tuning of this sample matches the original snare, that the character matches the original snare, and that the placement of the samples and the phase alignment matches the original snare. Because you can quickly end up ruining your original snare because somewhat the tuning is not correct, and you get a strange sound, and that you get some cancellations with the original snare. You really have to choose your samples in a way that it really fits and melts and blends perfectly with whatever original you have. Okay, next track is overheads. Let's listen to the overheads without any processing, and then we see what we did on it. Let's see what we did to those overhead microphones. Okay, I used Soothe. I use this very, very often on overheads and on room tracks, just to tame the harshness of cymbals a tiny little bit. So if the cymbal is hit, sometimes you get a little bit abrasive high end that is just annoying over time, and I want to soften it out a little bit. Let's see what this does. It's just getting a little bit sweeter when the cymbal is hit, not so, but a little bit more expensive sounding. And then we have some EQ going, again cutting out more of this high end. Let me show you what this does. So a little cut on the high end just to sweeten the high end of the cymbals a little bit more. And then we have a low cut. I don't want any bass drum or stuff on this kind of overhead recording. If it was like a jazz recording, I may leave it completely flat. But for this metal application, I want the low end tight and mainly from the main bass drum microphones and not so much from other microphones. That's why I cut out all the crap from the low end. And I had a little bit too much ring from the snare, which I removed here as well. Let me solo this and show you what I did. I just wanted a little bit less of that snare ring on the overhead just to get more focus on the cymbals and remove as much shell and kit sound as I could without it sounding artificial. That's it for the overheads. No big things happening here. Okay, next up is the tom track. There were only 3 places where the toms were hit, so I cut them clean and didn't use a gate again. I always clean up the toms manually, and sometimes I use spectral editing to remove cymbals out of toms. I actually made a video where I showed how you can de-bleed your toms in different, very effective ways. You can have a look at this. In this case, I cut them clean, and I did nothing else except cleaning up and added a little bit of reverb. Let's see how it sounds without the reverb. And with reverb. Nothing more going on. We made careful placement of the microphone, pretty perpendicular to the actual beta head to get a good low-end response, and that was pretty much it. Editing and adding some reverb, and we're good to go. Let's have a look at the close room microphone. This was my wooden head that is standing like 3 meters in front of the kit, and just listening from audience perspective to the drum set as a whole. Let's listen to what it sounds like without any processing. This is a really nice drum sound. It's just very natural, as if you were standing in the room listening to the set. But again, this is a metal context, and I wanted to carve out some things that I did not need in this room recording, and I'll show you what I did. First of all, oh yeah, some heavy EQing. Let's see what this EQ does. Cutting a lot of stuff. When you're EQing, you start somewhat. I think I started with cutting the high end because I don't want all that cymbal splash. We have overheads that give us a crisp cymbal sound. I don't need all of this too much on the room microphones. I wanted more body and like a sense of natural feeling of the drums, like standing in front of the drums and not only being like 5 centimeters from the shells, but listening to the drum kit from a little bit of distance. I removed some snare fundamental, I removed some honk from the middle and tamed the high end a little bit. So basically keeping more of the mid-range and some sense of depth of the drum set. What's next? Split EQ again. Ah yeah, interesting. I boosted, this seems like the bass drum fundamental. I just wanted to remove the sustain of the bass drum out of the room microphone without losing a little bit of that note. So boosting the transient and at the same time removing the sustain of the bass drum. Let's see what that sounds like. Yeah, it's interesting. I think I liked the low end information that I got from distance from the bass drum. Let me isolate so that you can hear this region on its own. It's adding a nice little poof, this little attack from the bass drum. Oftentimes with low frequencies, they just sound so much nicer from distance than if you are really, really close with your microphone. It just has some artificial quality to it if you are very close, and it's gaining naturality if you are a little bit further away. And in this case, I somehow liked what was going on the room microphones and wanted to enhance the low end of the whole kit by boosting the attack portion of the room microphone. Then we have some compression. It just makes the room sound bigger. Let me put it in and out. You get more sustain, shaving off a little bit of the attack of the room and let it pump in the groove of the song and just add some density and some richness to that room track and just make it a little bit more live feeling. Then next I have a multi-band compressor that is side-chained to the bass drum. Let's see what that does. Okay, while I liked the attack that we added with the split EQ, after compression, it was just getting a little bit too much low end, and I just wanted it to control the bass drum on the room track by using a sidechain compressor. So we are just using compression on the very low. Let me solo this for a second so that you can hear this band alone. Now I know what some of you may think. Why is he first boosting the low end and the punch of the low end just to suck it out again later? Well, first of all, when you mix, you start with something and you add something, you like it, and then you work with the result that you have and do whatever is necessary in the following steps that you are doing. So if at some point you end up by having too much low end, although you boosted it before, you just remove it. There's no big deal. But in this case, it is, I have some boost on the low end going into the compressor, which makes the compressor react in a different way as if I had no boost. So although I am first boosting and then removing that low end a little bit, it has a purpose because the compressor is just reacting to the bass drum in a different way as if I would go in flat first and then maybe not remove in the end. This order of things just worked fine for this track. So boosting low end, getting the compressor to pump, and then just regulate the low end a little bit again. It's different as if I wouldn't have boosted this and would have gone in flat into the compressor. It just works very fine this way, and it was the natural progression of the treatment of this track as I went along with it. Oh, we forgot the hi-hat. Let's see what the hi-hat does. I see that I edited it so that we just kept the hi-hats where they were actually played and cut out all the other crap just to keep the track clean. Let's see what it does without any treatment. Okay, there is split EQ. Yeah, I wanted to remove all the transient of any snare bleed coming into that hi-hat microphone. I just wanted the of the hi-hat microphone and not the attacks of the snare. So I removed the range where the snare has its attack of the body, and I just cut out only the transient portion of that range. Next, we have some carving. I was focusing really on the mid-range of that hi-hat microphone. I used SM57 on it. I know that this doesn't have the greatest high-end response, but I was not after high-end on this microphone in the first place. I wanted mid-range just to pull the hi-hat a little bit closer to the listener in the mix. We have enough high-end on the overheads and on the room microphones. We don't need that much sizzle up there. I just wanted the upper mid-range, and this is what we did here. We carved out all the low end. We removed all the high end and just kept the interesting part of the hi-hat. Let's listen to what that does. This is all I wanted from that microphone. It was the perfect addition in context of the overheads, so we just keep what we need and get rid of all the rest. Okay, next up we have time adjust. What did I do? I boosted a little bit of gain and aligned the hi-hat signal to the overheads, because I somehow felt that it was crisper and cleaner if the runtime from the hi-hat to the overhead microphones was adjusted, so that not we have hi-hat first and then hi-hat in the overheads a little bit later. It was a little bit washy. I just aligned them in time so that it sounds cleaner. That's all we did here. Okay, we have one final pair of microphones. These were the far room microphones that were not actually in the recording room, but they were outside the recording room. We left the door open so that some drum sound could spill around the corner into an untreated lounge of the studio. I really love to do this to get more live out of a drum set and let it sound as if it was recorded in a much bigger room than it actually was. Let's see what this pair of microphones sounds like. One addition I may do is I use ribbon microphones because they strongly reject what is on the axis of the actual diaphragm of the microphone. So everything which does not hit this membrane perpendicularly but in the axis is strongly rejected. And what I did is I oriented the microphones in a way that the dead spot of the microphones was pointing towards the drums. I didn't want any direct drum on these microphones. I just wanted as much diffuse sound from this untreated room as possible and as little direct sound as possible. We didn't want any attack, just diffuse room information. So let's listen what this sounds like without any treatment. Okay, I tried to get rid as much punch as possible, but real life does not always do what you want it to do. So we still have some punch. It's much less, as if the microphones were oriented towards the drums, but there is still some left. Let's see what we can do about this. First of all, we applied some EQ. Again, as with the other room microphones, we don't need that much high end. We don't need these splashy highs from room microphones. We want them pretty dark, so I removed all this crap up here. Let's listen to this. All the splashy stuff from the cymbals, we didn't need as much as we had. Then we didn't need the low end on the sides. I put a low cut that is only working on the sides because I didn't want this strange spread that these room microphones had. I wanted all low end information to be as center as possible, and by removing low end on the sides, you just leave low end in the center and none on the side. Let me bypass this band only so that you can hear the difference. If you're listening to this on a proper set of speakers or on headphones, you will immediately hear that without this low cut, the bass is coming from everywhere. And as soon as I engage this, whoop, all the low end information is only in the center, not weirdly on the sides, which can just mess up with the punch of the bass drum in the complete drum. And then I think here we had some snare resonance. Yeah, this from the snare, I didn't want this in the room track. Since we are going to apply more processing, all this stuff that we removed now, if we wouldn't have removed them, we would amplify it even more. So let's see what the next step is. Okay. Remove more transient from that track, especially the low end. It's always a problem. Low end instruments, they just spill everywhere. So the bass drum is just too much. And the big secret to get a punchy low end, especially on drums, is to only let work down there what is really working well down there. And these like diffuse room microphones, they don't do us a big service in terms of transient response. It's just getting washy. So I wanted to remove all transient information from the low end. And we also removed some resonance from the snare with this EQ. Let's listen to with and without. So you can hear the low end punch is not completely gone, but reduced by a big amount, which lets the original bass drum microphones be more punchy in context. Next up, some compression. Let's listen to this. Here again, the compression is working with a pretty fast attack to catch all the peaks and leave us mostly sustain. You cannot separate it completely, but we are working our way through removing as much attack as possible and gaining as much sustain. Why do we do that? Because we want size out of these microphones. We just want the drum kit to appear as if it was recorded in a much bigger room from bigger distance, just to get some size. And the further away you go from a source, or the more you are around the corner, the less attack you perceive. And by removing all kinds of attack from our recording, we are more and more giving the impression of having been further away in a larger room. Next up, more EQ, because with the compression and everything, we again got up more low-end stuff that we actually wanted. So let's cut out a little more. We don't need low end in this room. We have the bass drum microphone and we have all the low end we need. And next up, another multi-band compressor that is working again, triggered by the bass drum. We have the bass drum going on a sidechain bus, and we have this sidechain bus chosen as input for this compressor. So this compressor is reacting to the bass drum only. So as soon as the bass drum is hitting, this compressor is ducking down again the low end of this room track. Let's listen to it with and without. Let me solo that band. So it's again cleaning up all the low-end information of that room track. Of course, it's not sounding very, very pretty. It's pumping and it's distorting a little bit and it sounds pretty dirty on its own. But let me show you now, when we blend this in with drier tracks from the recording room, how it just opens up the whole stage and just lets the drum appear as if it was recorded in a much larger room than it actually was. So as you can hear, it does exactly what it's supposed to do, just enlarge the room. The final thing on this drum section is we have a little reverb. I hardly use any reverb on drums usually because it really quickly sounds very fake. If I can get around without using reverb, I don't use reverb. In this case, I just used it on the tom track, just because I didn't have a real way to get the tom to sound a little bit larger without messing with a lot of stuff. I see that I clip gained the room microphone where the tom was playing just to get a little bit more room, but it was not enough, and I just wanted to add a tiny bit of reverb to the tom just to let them sit a little bit more with the rest of the kit instead of just sticking out unnaturally. But except from this, I hardly ever use any reverb on drums. If I really need more size and I just can't get it out, most of the time it's on the snare. Really, you don't need reverb on the cymbals that much. You don't need reverb on the bass drum. So there is most of the time it's just the snare that you want to be bigger. And in this case, my first go would be try to work with whatever room mics I have the way we did. And if that's not enough, I just use a sample. Sometimes I just use room information from a sample. So I take a library, choose a snare that fits the one that we use, and I remove all the direct microphones and just use the actual room recordings of an actual real room. That sounds so much nicer than just pouring artificial reverb over a close mic'd snare. If you're wondering how do I get a natural big snare sound, maybe don't use reverb, but use a sample. Or if you want to use reverb, add reverb to your room tracks. The reverb just behaves differently. If you put it on a more distant track, it just enlarges the room in a more natural way than if you put it on a completely dry, let's say, snare track. Okay, that was pretty much it for the drums. I hope that there was something useful for you. Maybe you can use one or the other technique for your upcoming drum recording. And yeah, I'll see you next time with the next instrument group.